Welcome back. Again, I am Kristin Bell, and we're going to talk through some of the revenue components, and we're going to dive in a little bit more on how those are calculated tonight. So just to review real quickly the vocabulary and or acronyms that you'll be hearing throughout this process. Real quick, the FTE or full-time equivalent, that can be when you're speaking about a student enrollment qualifier, or it can also be relative to an employment level of a staff member. The AAFTE, the annualized average full-time equivalent, is referring to student FTE, and what that is we submit our enrollment to OSPI, they add it up every month, and they divide by however month, 10 months ultimately of the school year, and then that number is what they use for our generating our revenue. OSPI, of course, Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. CTE, Career and Technical Ed. CIS, we're going to talk about that a little bit more tonight. That is a certificated instructional unit, and that is kind of code for, you can think of as teacher units. CAS is the certificated administrative unit. Those would be your principals and so forth. And the CLS are the classified units. And then SPED, used commonly as special education. Starting off with some kind of foundational budget concepts around our state revenue, our state funding rather. This graphic shows the budget for 2021 current year is that $496 million number. As you can see, the majority of our revenue does come from the state. The yellow over there would be our local taxes collected. There's two layers embedded in that local tax. One is from our very generous voters who have approved local levies for us to collect taxes on. Additionally, there are some non-tax local supports in there, which would be, I believe I spoke on the last couple of slides, your food service revenues or your library fines, fees, anything collected locally at the building level. Then in orange, we have the federal revenue, and those can be through grants. And we spoke last time, either coming directly to us from either the Department of Ed or the federal agency, or generally speaking, they do come and flow through OSPI to us. And then that little other in the bottom category there, the gray, that represents some revenue from other school districts, foundations, grants, and sometimes like a capital projects transfer. We can transfer monies excuse me, between funds under certain circumstances, if you recall from the last presentation. So this graphic here just kind of shows the flow of how the dollars are determined. So the legislative operating budget is determined, and they work on a 2-year biennium, and they just finished in April of this year, the 21 to 23 operating budget. So they make decisions and they pass bills and so forth, and then certain driver rates are determined based on that legislative language. And so those rates and drivers flow into OSPI essentially, and then OSPI applies those rates, and on the left-hand side there, they'll apply it to formula allocations, which is on the little bullets down there. You can see those are your classroom teachers are developed through a formula, your materials, supplies, and operating costs. You'll hear us refer to that as MSOC. That's what that stands for. Your special education revenue coming from the state is a formula, your CTE and highly capable, and those are all based on student enrollment, those formulas are. On the right-hand side of the screen are your competitive grants, and those are things like that Title IX there, and full service community schools, some CTE or healthcare career academies, and those are just samples, but essentially what that means is each district has to apply for those funds, and then depending on need or competition or however the evaluation process goes, you may or may not receive those dollars. So given the fact that the state dollars are the largest portion of our revenue in the 21-22 budget, you can see there it's about 74, not quite 75%, but just about. So what I'd like to show here is you've got under the state apportionment, dollars, you have three main categories. You have the basic education, the career and technical ed, and then special education. And those dollars come in, and the basic education dollars come through us through what's called a prototypical model. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we move into this presentation. And then the career and technical ed, again, is through a prototypical model. However, you will notice that I've used red font on that. And the reason I did that is those are dollars with strings. So those dollars come into the system and they need to be spent on CTE, or career and technical ed expenditures. The ones on the left, the prototypical model, those come in as green. Districts have the freedom to spend as they feel appropriate. And then on the far right there, special education state dollars, again, very, very red. Those have very specific intentions also with those monies. So of the dollars that I just showed you on that previous slide, student enrollment is the driver, along with those legislative rates and so forth. But each individual district reports their enrollment. So every month on the first day of October through June, and then the fourth day of school, we take a snapshot of our enrollment and we send that to OSPI. And then that's where they add up and identify that annualized average FTE. And then once they identify that AAFTE, they plug that number into their prototypical school funding formula, and that kicks out a number of allocated staff units. And if you recall at the very beginning when I talked about the acronyms, those certificated instructional staff equals those are units. They're not like people or or actual FTE. It's a different measurement that they provide. So just the graphic there, your enrollment, we send that off to OSPI, and then they put it into their prototypical and kick back how many units they will fund us on. So one thing I just want to kind of reiterate here is that when OSPI provides us those monies and comes in and kicks out prototypical funding, that's just a model for funding. That does not mean that the district has to spend it that way. So if it kicks out, you get, I don't know, X amount of librarians, for example. If the district wanted to do more or less, that's fine. That's the district's prerogative. That's just a funding formula to get the revenue into the hands of the district. They do have three levels of funding through that prototypical model. There's the school level funding, which are going to be your teachers and your basically your teachers, and then other school funding is admin, secretaries, counselors, nurses, things like that. And then district level would be your administration. Okay, so here is a little bit of a busy slide, but what I want to show you is on the left-hand side there where it has school classroom ratios. Those class sizes are determined by the legislature. Okay, so they say your prototypical model is going to fund based on 17 students per classroom, one teacher unit per 17 kindergartners, for example, and so forth, and it goes down through the grades. So on the right hand side there, there's a planning time embedded into each allocation. So if you look at the blue at the bottom here, you take the enrollment in the school, you divide it by the class size. So let's say you're taking first grade, then you multiply it by 1 plus the planning time factor. So if I'm talking about elementary, my planning time factor over here on the right would be 15.5%, which would equal the funded teacher units. This I want to note here this TPS embeds specialist teachers during the times at elementary level, music, library, and PE. So from a functional standpoint, when a teacher is in their planning time, the students will go to music, library, or PE. And additionally, these teachers also have a planning time embedded in their schedule too. And that's all per CBA and so forth. CBA, acronym, right? Collective Bargaining Agreement. I apologize. Okay, this is the So let me go back here. This is the classroom prototypical model or the school level. This one is the other school level. So these are the other types of positions I spoke of. So your guidance counselors, nurses, psychologists, custodians, and so forth. So the prototypical model assumes a baseline of these student enrollment numbers. So for every 400 students at elementary, you're going to get 1.253 principal, 0.663 librarian, and so forth. And then at the middle school, for every 432 students, you get these allocations. And likewise for 600 students at the high school. So if we're going to use an example here, if I was going to identify how many staffing units would the state fund our district for a high school with 1,344 students, given that slide I just showed. So the first thing you want to do is identify your multiplier. So we know if this is a high school we're talking about, and we're saying there's 1,344 students. So we would take 1,344 and we would divide that by 600, which gives us a multiplier of 2.24 for this particular high school. So 2.24 is my multiplier. And then based on this right here, these decimal points right here, we're going to apply that multiplication across the board. So what that's doing ultimately, and you can see the type of position there, that a principal is a CAS, or a certificated administrative staff. The CIS is the teacher unit, and so forth. And so you can see the total here collectively, the OSPI would fund us on 7.12 CIS units, 4.21 CAS units, and 15.74 CLS units. This for these types of positions. If we wanted to talk about how many teachers or additional staffing units they would give us, these are CISs here, but they're, a counselor is a certificated staff member, for example, not necessarily a classroom teacher. These are the classroom teachers. So what you do here again, as I spoke of a minute ago, you take your 1344, you divide it by your classroom ratio, and then you multiply it by 1 point. This is a secondary, so it'd be 1.2, and that would kick out your teacher units. In this case, they'd give us 56.12 teacher units for classrooms. Okay, so then what we do is we need to convert those units into dollars. And the way we do that is this blue section right down here. So we would take, for example, 56.12 classroom teacher units right down here. You would multiply that by the average state rate, which is provided by the legislature. And in this case, for the upcoming year, it's $68,937. And then each district has a regionalization percentage, and that is determined, that is not up to us. It is given to us and provided to us of what we are. So Tacoma's is 12%. And then you take that number and you multiply it by IPD, which is the implicit price deflator, which does change each year. It's kind of like, it's similar to maybe a cost of living, but it's not. I mean, you can kind of think of it that way. But this next year, there's a 2% implicit price deflator. And then when you do that calculation, it kicks out the dollars that the state will give us for those units. And again, this 68,937 is the rate for a CIS, or a certificated instructional unit. So we would get funded on those 56.14, and then we'd also get funded on the 7.12 here in that category. And then for the CAS and the CLS, they have different rates right here. And so that kicks out a number. Now, the kicker here is that, again, the dollars that are coming in through the prototypical model, they come into the district. You've got your state and federal categorical, and then you've got your levy. So again, though they give us dollars on 56 units of teachers, that doesn't mean that we have to fund or have 56 units of teachers. We can spend those dollars however the district decides is appropriate. That's just the way, again, it gets to the district. Um, One of the tricky things here that I want to point out is this funded allocation. I don't have the math done right now, but this number times this does not take into account how much you're actually paying your teachers. So every district has its own collective bargaining agreement and has identified salary ranges and optional days and things like that embedded in it. And this particular rate essentially doesn't care, right? So if one unit here was 68,937 times the 12 times the 2, um, your teacher, you may be funding your teacher at $90,000, for example, and let's say I apologize, I don't have this number off the top of my head, but let's say this number comes out to be 74,000. So 74,000. Yet we're paying the teacher 85,000, right? So that delta between what funded allocation coming in is and what the actual cost of the staff member is going out is paid for out of right here. This enrichment funding levy, that's the only place we can go for those dollars, right? So if they only give us a portion here, the levy has to pick those up. So it's kind of a twofold. So they tell us how many units they'll provide, and then for each unit, it's a set rate. So we may have more teachers provided than the units we receive, and we may pay out more than the revenue we receive. So that's all I have for this particular segment. This is kind of a tricky topic, and so I really encourage you to write down any questions you have, watch it again, um, bring your questions to the next budget advisory committee meeting, and if I can't answer them during the actual meeting itself due to time constraints, or if it's something I have to go check on, I can get back to you via email or bring it back to the next meeting. So again, don't hesitate to ask, and I will look forward to seeing you on our virtual meetings. Thank you. Bye-bye.